Hello, I'm Guido Girgenti, and you're listening to Bloc Party, a show about the fight for the soul of the Democratic Party. My name is Guido. This is your first time joining us. I work to elect Justice Democrats and co-host this show. Today, group chat, where I invite my friends to a Zoom call in the middle of the day and try to make sense of the news that I'm reading about American life and American politics. In the DMs this afternoon, once again, the home team from episode 1, Waleed Shahid, the spokesperson for Justice Democrats, and my co-host. Waleed, how are you today?
Oh, I can't hear Guido when he's on the music. I don't know what he said.
We lost Waleed.
Is it my turn?
Waleed, how are you today?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm excited for the snow day here in New York, and hopefully I will get to leave my apartment and experience life as it is in the real world.
In the meat space.
In the meat space.
Also with us, Amira Hassan, political director of Justice Democrats. Last time we heard from her, agreed to be a guest host of an episode about foreign affairs and Emily in Paris. Amira, how are you today?
I'm doing okay. But also, we're off Emily in Paris. So have you heard about the happiest season? Okay, just like the news, pop culture just keeps moving forward, Guido. It's old news. Emily in Paris is old news until the next season drops.
Well, Amira, I'm happy that you're moving through the leisure TV shows quickly. I know you're planning to go on vacation for the last 2 weeks. I was ready to give everyone a nice 2-week break from Bloc Party, take Christmas and New Year's off.
Guido, you're the only Christian on this podcast.
Okay, well, actually, I'm Roman Catholic.
Well, I need you to know that what they've said about me is true, and I'm waging a war on Christmas. I don't know if Amira is part of the war or not. I know Ilhan Omar is part of the war.
Wow.
But
oh my God. I am recusing myself from this entire conversation.
You know, my dad used to say every Christmas, looks like Santa forgot us again. So
okay, that's like, really funny.
but Allah still loves you, Waleed, and that's what's important.
Hey, the third in the trilogy is always the best.
Oh, okay, that's a whole episode unto itself. But
I'm having none of this.
As always, Amira, so wise. She's not going to insert herself into a fight between the world's major monotheistic religions. No. Anyways, before we take a holiday break from Bloc Party, we have a very Bloc Party topic to dive into today. Over the past week, a good chunk of lefty media has been debating strategies that the squad, or more broadly, the left wing of the Democratic Party, should pursue in Congress in 2021. And I think part of what's driving the debate is that there's the basic fact of congressional math shifting, right? Just like the basic facts of how Congress is changing from 2020 into 2021 is the squad is bigger while the Democratic majority has shrunk. So there are slimmer margins on close party line votes. Meanwhile, you have more progressives than you've ever had before. Amir, help me get the math right here. Just tell us the facts, the Democratic majority, the size of the margin. Give us the number.
Yeah, so Democrats hold 222 seats, only 4 above the 218 needed. So it is, when we are saying slim margins, it is very, very, very slim.
Right. New members of the squad, like Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, are officially taking their seats in Congress next year. The squad is bigger than ever. So people are debating, what is the best way to use the leverage that might be there for the taking for progressives, given that math, given that political situation? And more specifically, should progressives consider using that leverage against Nancy Pelosi when she seeks to win re-election as Speaker of the House? Here's radio host Sam Cedar of the Majority Report laying out that question in early December.
What can progressives get from Pelosi in exchange for their votes? There's also, there could be a couple of moderates who are not voting for Pelosi.
Now, in just the past week, a much more specific proposal for how to use this leverage has gained more traction. A very popular radio host, Jimmy Dore, told the squad,
Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, Ro Khanna, people like that, Ayanna Pressley, people who are actually have progressive policies. Now they have leverage. What's their leverage, Jimmy? Well, Nancy Pelosi needs their vote for speaker, right? Because the Democrats and Nancy Pelosi performed so poorly that they lost seats in the House under Donald Trump. So now the margin is really small, right? So just a handful of progressives could say, Nancy Pelosi, we're withholding our vote from you for speaker unless you bring up Medicare-for-All for vote on the floor. That's our deal. Now, it's up to Nancy Pelosi. Do you want to risk your speakership, or do you want to make sure we have a vote on a basic human right?
This debate got heated quickly on Twitter, and that made me not want to discuss this on Bloc Party because I personally didn't want to make a podcast that felt like it was an extension of Twitter. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought that Jimmy Dore's proposal, like it or not like it, I think there are real questions of strategy and leverage and demand and tactics that it's getting at, and I don't know, maybe we could try it. What do you think, Waleed? Can we dive into this and have a better time than we'd have on Twitter?
You know, Twitter is a medium that you try to enter with the best of intentions. You share jokes, you share your favorite passages from Civil War history, your favorite Lincoln quotes. You go viral with some posts about Bernie and AOC and the squad. Maybe I should use I statements instead of the second person here. But then you pretty quickly get hooked into this game of trying to boost the numbers of the tweets you get. It's you can't help yourself. And you figure out what works on Twitter. What do the people like? And you know what they like, Guido? They like outrage. They like conflict. They like drama. This is why you can be at different stages in different parts of the ideological spectrum. But if you are a master of conflict and outrage, you will excel at Twitter. And if outrage doesn't capture the full extent of the debate, well, then maybe the other parts of the debate will not get as much attention on Twitter. You know, I can say this myself. Like, if I give a nuanced point, I'll get like 5 likes. 2 of the likes are on the show right now, and then my tweets don't do very well. Some of my best tweets are me being outraged and trying to provoke some sort of conflict that I don't see people talking about. And so I'm not absolving myself from this, but we're all incentivized to say, if I want to get positive feedback, positive reinforcement, I gotta dunk for the crowd, shit on some people.
My best tweet was probably selfies. So I don't know. We have different experiences here.
It's different. I don't post selfies. Not part of my brand.
Not part of the brand.
Maybe I should. Yeah. Instagram has a different set of incentives. I will say that. But I'm not super excited about like trying to analyze the factional strategy on Twitter and the response on Twitter as related to real life because of the incentive structure of Twitter. But, we can try to discern a strategic path that maximizes our progressive victories and minimizes our losses. And I'm not sure if Twitter and analyzing Twitter is the best medium for that. But Guido, as you know, the world may be bad and Twitter may be bad, but the vibes can still be good at the Bloc Party because we are able to communicate in more than a few hundred characters at a time.
I don't know. I kind of want to start like seeing how the podcast would do if we start just like yelling and screaming at each other. Seems like the thing to do. I don't know. Just a thought. We've got to get the numbers up.
All right. Sometime, Amira, you can yell at me to juice the numbers. But for today, I'd like to have this discussion, as a good faith debate. I think we need to grow this muscle to be able to have a fruitful discussion about this because the squad is going to keep growing this next decade. And right now, the squad is the smallest that it'll be for the next 10 years, hopefully. So I think how different factions should wield their power in Congress is a conversation that we're going to have consistently. I'm going to try to follow Waleed's tagline. The world can be bad, strategy can be hard, but vibes can still be good. Even if we are discussing a debate where a lot of key things did take place on Twitter. For example, after Jimmy Dore made his pitch, AOC responded on Twitter. Her key points: 1, there's no organizing plan here. What is step 2 when you lose the floor vote, as you're likely to do. Number two, the margins are razor thin, and the Dem no's to Pelosi could be greater than the margin. What risks are we taking on with the speakership if progressives were to pursue that? And lastly, she said that there are opportunity costs, that if you choose to fight on this rather than something else, like passing a $15 minimum wage, there's a cost to what you choose to do because you can't fight every fight at once. So obviously this is not a policy debate about Medicare for All. We're not debating different versions of Medicare for All. We are debating strategy, tactics, how we're going to use the power that we may have at our disposal as progressives and win more victories, and what tactics are best suited to that. But before we get to that nitty-gritty of strategy and tactics, I think it might be helpful to understand what is the state of play in the Democratic Party around Medicare for All. Like, before we say the squad should definitely pursue this or that strategy, can you lay out for us what has happened around the politics of Medicare for All this year, from the presidential primary to now?
The game board has been reset. Okay, there are no more presidential primaries for now. Biden's going to, set the agenda for the party at the very top. And he explicitly ran on not supporting Medicare for All, right? I think it was him and Klobuchar who were the only candidates who, very explicitly said, we do not support this. And now he's the president-elect. So what is next? What now? Right? And I think a lot of people are sort of trying to process this in real time and are like, okay, what happens? Where does Medicare for All go? How do we keep it alive? How do we keep this movement in conversation? And I think there's another part, that Waleed had mentioned in the real group chat, which is that a lot of people are also, processing and grieving the primaries. I feel like right now we didn't have that time when it was happening because COVID was the only thing we all were able to think about, right? And then there was the uprisings, there were all these other things that were happening. And now the reality of not Bernie is setting in.
Yeah, I think that some progressives are still waging a fight as if we are in the 2020 presidential primaries, but the context has changed. The context of the fight has changed, and therefore the strategies and tactics have to somewhat change as well, we need to integrate the fact that Joe Biden ran a campaign saying over and over again that he opposed Medicare for All.
And just to be clear, the way that you think that the context is different in a presidential primary than now is because we don't know who the presidential nominee is going to be. We haven't made this major decision about what person, what faction, what wing of the party is going to set the agenda from the top. And that's the possibility that was open when we were going head-to-head with Biden on Medicare for All that you're saying is different now.
I think there's two things, to go back to the post-Bernie grief. The first stage of grief is denial. People remember that clearly after Bernie lost South Carolina, and then we went into Super Tuesday, and people were like, we can still do it. And then anger, where people were like, oh, this was a fixed process by President Obama and other moderates to collude against Bernie Sanders. Then there was depression, where many people felt that Joe Biden was not the best nominee for the Democratic side. And I think we're heading into the stage of grief that it's called bargaining, where we're like, okay, Bernie's not the president, but how are we still going to get our demands met by Congress and by Joe Biden? But it's still within that process of grief. And so I think at a certain point you have to judge Joe Biden for who he is and not pretend that he is Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. Now, to clarify, I'm not saying abandon Medicare for All or stop advocating for it. I'm saying that the way that you advocate for it could change. The thing that Jimmy Dore and others want to see happen, which is to shame people for being like, you don't support healthcare, you don't support climate action. That's the opposite of that happens, which is that people do support those things, but you're showing the entire American public that the things progressives want to do are not deliverable. And lots of people want to see things that you can actually see happen. And there's a lot of room to push Joe Biden on many parts of Medicare for All. David Sirota laid out some of them, like hiring tens of thousands of new nurses and doctors and federally investing in that, moving toward a more robust public option that takes on the insurance companies in a much more vociferous way than Joe Biden's current plan does. And a lot of those elements are within the Medicare-for-All bill, but it's not necessarily the
Right.
entire bill itself. And so it's funny that AOC uses this phrase, like there's no stage 2, because it reminds me of the underpants note, where I always come back to, where it's like,
Phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 2, Phase 3, profit.
vote on Medicare for all. Stage 2, we don't know. Stage 3, Medicare for all happens. And I'm like, let's talk about stage 2.
Well, engaging with the proponents of the strategy in good faith, I think there is an imagined step 2, right? Which is what you said, Waleed, which is like all these people are going to go to vote against it, and they're going to vote against it in the midst of the pandemic. And I feel like that's part of the grieving too, is that the Bernie campaign ends in early March, and then the coronavirus lockdown happens, and there's like this tragic feeling of like, had this healthcare emergency happened slightly earlier alongside this message of Medicare for all, when it still could have won, would that have changed things?
Yes, exactly.
That is,
Yes.
you think that's a big part of what's happening?
I think people are right that if the virus had hit us in 2019, the idea that you would move millions of people off private insurance would have been more politically palatable. And I think many people who supported Bernie Sanders, and including myself, are like, we spent an entire 2 years debating whether or not the American people, whether voters could digest the fact that private insurance was not the end-all, be-all of American healthcare. And then millions of people were thrown off their private insurance between March and June, and because they lost their jobs. And so I do think that there's a lot of lingering anger and grief from that happening, because it is absurd how quickly things can change when you have a global pandemic. And then not only that, but then Joe Biden's healthcare plan doesn't change at all, which is rubbing salt in the wounds a little bit too. And it is absurd that we live in a country where you have, if you don't have enough money in your pocket, you can't get healthcare. And Medicare for All advocates are right about that. But it's also important to know that the most prominent Medicare for All advocates, like the National Nurses Union and Pramila Jayapal, many of the groups that advocate for single-payer healthcare on the Hill, do not support this strategy. And they've spent years, essentially maybe since 2009, working on Medicare for All advocacy, and to insinuate they don't have a spine or they're shills or something like this seems pretty disingenuous.
Yeah, and if the shared goal of this whole endeavor is to figure out a path to winning Medicare for All, I think it's a real wasted opportunity to dismiss organizations and leaders who disagree with your initial tactical proposal, but have been working on the issue for years, some of them decades. I think if the goal really is to find the best strategy and to workshop these ideas until they're the best that they can be, if you have folks who are working on Medicare for All who disagree with what you're proposing, I think that's a great time for a strategy retreat, and invite them, lay out your case, and give them a chance to poke holes in it and see if they can help you anticipate challenges that you can't foresee, right? Like, if I was in that meeting, I think I would say, I think the concreteness of the congressional math can make us feel like this is really the hardball strategy we need, right? Because whipping those votes to exploit Democrats' slim majority is such a clear tactic. But I think in a good strategy retreat, you'd start to ask, well, what are we misjudging, right? For example, that slim margin is a lever of power that anyone in the House of Representatives could think of exploiting. Right, Amira? You can give us the math again.
Democrats have 222 seats. So she can afford to lose 4 votes. And that means 4 of any side, right? Like, people are really focused on the fact that progressives, their margins increase, they have these numbers, but so do other people, right? And so when you're playing at this game of like, these are the numbers and that needs to be a part of the calculus, progressives are not in a vacuum.
Right. And I think AOC has been upfront about that, where on the merits she agrees that Pelosi does not deserve to continue on in House Democratic leadership. But at the same time, I think takes seriously playing out the different scenarios that could happen if Pelosi really doesn't have the votes and you open up that power vacuum in the House. Are you so certain that the left will benefit from that situation? Here's AOC discussing that with Jeremy Scahill of the Intercepted podcast this week.
Are you ready to say Pelosi and Schumer need to go?
I mean, I think so. I mean, and the hesitancy that I have is that I want to make sure that if we're pointing people in a direction, that we have a plan. And my concern, and this I acknowledge as a failing, as something that we need to sort out, is that there isn't a plan. How do we fill that vacuum? Because if you create that vacuum, there are so many nefarious forces at play to fill that vacuum with something even worse. What I'm looking at right now is what steps do we take, both in structural changes, because a lot of this is not just about these two personalities, but they are also about the structural shifts that these two personalities have led in their time in leadership, the structural shifts of power in the House, both in process and rule, to concentrate power in party leadership of both parties, frankly, but in Democratic Party leadership to such a degree that an individual member has far less power than they did 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so, do we need new leadership of the Democratic Party? Absolutely. But how do we ensure that when we shift, we don't even move further to the right? And that's the kind of thing that keeps me up when I think about what we're going to do moving towards the future.
So I'll give you the same question. Is it time for Pelosi to go? And I'll add, is AOC really right to say that actually sinking Pelosi's reelection as Speaker of the House risks moving the speakership and thus the House to the right?
Well, Pelosi is going. She's on her way out. This is supposed to be her last term. She said this will be her last term.
Yes, I obviously think it's time for new leadership in the Democratic Party. Go back to 2016, you'll find statements from me on the record that Chuck Schumer should not be in Democratic Party leadership. And so I've been there. But, I think AOC's point is also right that if you were to tank Pelosi, it is possible that the person who replaces her would be even more hostile to progressives than her.
Yeah. Who actually would be willing to change the iron grip that leadership has had on the House, right? Like, they have consolidated a lot of power over the years. And if we just, you change Pelosi as leader and then somebody else just steps right into the exact same power, then we haven't really moved the needle that much. Actually working towards the structural issues while you know that she is on her way out sounds like a better idea for progressives than just like getting some young blue dog moderate in there because, we hate Pelosi. Like, if you look at the top 3 leaders, top 4, there isn't really anyone that would be a better option.
Top 4 leaders of the Democrats in the House.
Yeah, you have Steny Hoyer. He is well to the right of Pelosi. You have Clyburn. You have, Hakeem Jeffries, who's, seen as the heir apparent to Pelosi, who's younger, who is pretty actively hostile towards the left, but also is really young and could hold on to the speakership for a really long time. You run down all of these options and you're like, okay, well, actually, perhaps we need to succession plan and figure out who would be who could be ready to take the reins for progressives in 2 years from now.
There's also some congressional math about the Speaker of the House. 22% of Congress is currently made up of members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And about 24% of Congress is made up of members of the New Democratic Coalition, which is the business-friendly caucus of Democrats. And then 22% is also made up of the Blue Dog Caucus. And so the Speaker of the House is responsive to the math that he or she has to deal with. And making it a personality issue about Pelosi is not necessarily the only thing going on here. She's also responding to the number of votes that she has in her caucus and what she needs to get to 50+1 votes to pass something. And so the efforts of people to elect more people like Jamal Bowman or AOC goes a much longer way than trying to fight about who the speaker is necessarily, because the speaker is also ultimately accountable to the votes in her or his caucus. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, you're saying ultimately the job of the Speaker of the House is to manage the Democratic caucus. And that caucus is made up of factions that are growing and shrinking in size each cycle. And out of that growing and shrinking, you get the balance of power and the congressional math and the vote counting. To the speaker, it's like whatever their personal persuasion, this is what I hear you saying, there's always an institutional dynamic where ultimately they are really accountable to the math at hand and to their job of trying to manage the caucus. So you can keep changing the math in your favor cycle after cycle. Your faction's always getting bigger. You'll be on the path to power regardless of who ends up as speaker. I think we've covered that. Let's set aside the race for speaker. Even if we set that aside, I think that there is this strategic insight that Jimmy Dore is seizing on, that a lot of other people are seizing on, rightly so, of if there's leverage to be used, and there is leverage to be used, then where should it be used? AOC, again, in her initial reply, mentioned raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour in the first 100 days of the Biden administration, which she said was doable. Is that a good idea? I mean, is there a case against flexing your power to win on the minimum wage right now?
Jimmy Dore and some of his supporters online were like, why should we support for a $15 minimum wage? We need a $25 minimum wage. And Biden and Pelosi already support a $15 minimum wage, so why would we push for that? But, the point is that it took a movement to get there, and it was called the Fight for 15. Fast food workers went on strike. I used to work for the Fight for 15. Union members advocated for this on the Hill and all over the country, on the local level, state level, federal level. And even Bernie Sanders says, it's not me, us. Things are not going to get accomplished unless we fight for it, including things that are already supported by Democratic Party leadership. And so the argument continues, why would you lose your leverage to force a vote on something they've already committed to? And then my feeling is, wait, no, that's the opposite of how it works. We have not actually raised the federal minimum wage to $15. That is not in the bag. Of course, you have to use your leverage to guarantee that you get that all the way through. There are several things that Biden is not, even things that Biden supports, that we're not going to get through unless we push for it. And it took 6 years to get to the place where Democratic Party leadership would support Fight for 15. It took thousands of fast food workers walking off the job and going on strike, risking their jobs to get to that point. And it's basically this fundamental point where progressives are used to the idea that our role is to move the Overton window. But we don't know what it looks like. We don't even have the muscles to figure out how to open the Overton door that we've created ourselves. Even when you have Democratic support for things, that doesn't mean they're necessarily going to happen, as you saw with something like the public option in 2009.
Throughout this debate, I think part of what's difficult and part of the way people talk past each other on Twitter is they will also say, well, we agree with you, Waleed. We're saying that we need to build a movement. But a big way to build a movement is to pick this really high stakes, really high profile fight and use the speakership leverage to do that. Jimmy Dore shared a video as part of this debate that features AOC's words about movement building.
All of Washington is not incentivized, on the whole, not incentivized to work in actually expediting guaranteed healthcare in the United States. Now, does that mean it's not going to happen? Absolutely not. Because mass movement organizing can force it to happen.
And then they respond to AOC's words and are like, okay, so go do it. But I'm like, wait, no, AOC is saying in the clip, like, hey, this whole place is broken. This is really hard. It's not impossible to win these things, but you're gonna have to build a movement. Like you, like all of you. It's like Bernie being like, not me, us. And I think that if we were on the cusp of a really high stakes floor vote, because we're gonna seize the opportunity of this pandemic, I think we would see more evidence of that without the squad doing anything, because we would see a movement barging into politicians' offices and yelling at them.
Right, and there's still a lot more. I understand the frustration from people on the left that Medicare for All seems like a common sense idea. It's more conservative than the system in place in the United Kingdom right now, which is a nationalized healthcare system. It obviously makes sense to us, but it reminds me that millions of dollars were spent against both Bernie Sanders and Medicare for All in 2019 and 2020, and highlighting the idea that Medicare for All would take away your private health insurance and raise your taxes. And I think we still haven't done the analysis or retrospective on that of what was our response as a progressive movement to millions of dollars being spent on earned media and paid media and mail and TV and digital ads to convince Democratic voters that Medicare for All would threaten your health care and raise your taxes. And that was just a taste of it. Now imagine there's an actual vote happening on that issue. It's going to be hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars of that kind of earned media and paid media effort.
The thing is, we're building on actually growing the numbers of elected officials who are supportive of all of these progressive policies, but they are in an institution. They are, facing political institutional constraints, and, recognizing those realities is not the same as capitulating to those realities, right? Like when people tell you this is the lay of the land, right? And the feedback is, well, you all are joining the nothing is possible. You guys, y'all are sellouts, la, 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 all of that good stuff. You could say that. Don't hero worship, but the reality is those constraints are still there. You should think through all of that is presented, information gather, and there's so many people who are working towards changing the institution, right? So that when movements are knocking on those doors and demanding more, it can happen.
That's a very helpful pearl of wisdom from Amira. I'll keep that one. Recognizing realities that are constraining you is not the same as capitulating to those realities. That just reminds me, everything that I've done in my life that I am proud of in politics, like the early work, bringing together the strategy and the goals of the Sunrise Movement, the best campaigns I ever ran as a college student, the best electoral campaigns I've ever worked on, all of them, the thing they have in common is that at some point before shit really could hit the fan, I spent 3 to 9 months with the team of people I was going to work with, just planning, talking, hashing out scenarios. And it reminds me good strategy comes out of having that space and time to wrestle with what is right and what is just and what should be happening and what is possible, and maximizing the overlap between those two at any given moment. And, if I was working with someone who really was committed to this tactic of forcing a floor vote on Medicare for All, I think I would take a step back and say, I think that the strategy is informed by some broader guiding ideas about the power progressives have in this moment. And I think naming what those guiding strategic ideas are is a way to both build common ground, but also just know that we're talking about the same thing, right? If I was debating someone, I'd say, hey, let's pause and try to identify, what are the kernels of good strategy that both of us are working off of here? For example, 1, the squad can wield real power if you vote as a bloc, and there is an opportunity, but maybe also risks in that slim margin. 2, progressives need to seize the opportunity of the crisis, both the pandemic and millions of Americans being thrown out of their health insurance and thrown out of gainful employment. And, third, we want to ensure that the battles that we pick in Congress are going to help grow the movement outside of Congress. And I think that's like an instinct that I see shared by folks across this debate. What do you two think? Do you think that is that's my good faith proposal of the common ground here?
Yeah, I think that this is the best read, the kindest, the most good faith read of everything. That is correct. I think that, which of course is exactly all of the assumptions we're making on this podcast because the vibes are good.
Always try to give the kindest take. But is something missing from that?
Well, progressives have spent a lot of time on the outside building movements. But then now in this other phase, you have elected officials who are with you, who are fully there to push on all of these progressive policy ideals. The left has not had this before, right? On this scale, at the very least. We've had progressive champions, we've had individuals here and there, but we've never had the numbers to really do stuff on the inside. And we're getting there. We're not all the way there yet, but we're getting there. And in that process, these people, these elected officials are also navigating this institution and they're building this muscle, right? This is going to take a while. And if we just scream bloody sellout at every person that tries to explain the constraints to us, elected officials are actually saying, hey, I hear you. This is an idea. Let's walk through this. And you just keep yelling at them. I mean, you could do it, but that's not a constructive brainstorming session.
And you're saying there's just a whole world of what organizing is like inside Congress that we're just beginning to get a sense of how to navigate because we haven't been there before.
Yes.
It's a whole new world.
It's a whole new world.
Waleed, what about you? Sound right? Would you add anything? What are our starting points for strategy here?
I can imagine putting myself in, a 2014, 2015 version of myself, hearing what Amira just said and being really annoyed and being like, Amira, just a product of the system. She doesn't know. She doesn't know that we just need to fight harder and scream harder and organize harder. And, 5 years later, I'm like, Amira has some points. And this shit is complicated. And if it wasn't complicated, then this would be a lot easier. But it's actually really hard. I mean, Guido has to teach himself how to make a podcast. I got to teach myself how to elect a bartender and a principal to Congress. And then that bartender and that principal have to figure out how to whip their colleagues to vote for something. And then their colleagues have to figure out how to defeat Republicans and Kevin McCarthy. There's a lot of stuff going on. And I think being humble and also being bold, there is a balance between those two things. But I do think there is a place for some humility. And, the people I've learned from the most are people who have actually, progressives who have spent a lot of time trying to figure these things out and trying to make it better as well.
Wow. What a well-adjusted comment.
Yeah, I think humility is a great way to think about it. I think it is bold to, be starting from a strategy of let's consider what would happen if the squad, like the Freedom Caucus, chose to block some votes. But just because that is a good broad idea, then there's the specific question of okay, what do we do in the next 3 months? And I think the answer you start to hear when you push and push and push is well, the reason this is going to work is that the squad is going to set off this movement, right? And I've heard these arguments said, people will say there is a large progressive base out there waiting to mobilize if you give them a clear fight, if the squad picks a clear fight. And I'm honestly, as an organizer and a progressive, I'm hey, if that is true, wait, why are you waiting? Just don't wait for them. Just start mobilizing. If that base is out there, and second, if there is a big movement out there, what else is that movement doing other than just targeting the squad right now?
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point there, which is that there's a lot of scrutiny over the squad because they're the only players in town. But many other people could be players and organize people to be elected to Congress and organize legislators and organize call-ins, and you can't do it at the last minute also. And so I do think that, like, because they're in the game and one of the only players in the game, and they know this too, they're held to a much higher standard. But as you say, there's a lot of things that can happen before just asking the squad to do every single thing.
Yeah, and then the argument becomes like, well, who dares vote against Medicare for All in the midst of a pandemic, and how could you do that? And like, how could you not seize this opportunity? And I mean, I feel that way about climate change. Like, it does feel horrific at a certain point to constantly make political strategies, constantly read climate plans, and just know that, like, what we are doing is we are trying to prevent millions of unnecessary deaths and disease and droughts and disasters. But we can't move fast enough, and it's why politics is horrible. I think, like, what Sunrise, to use the climate example, does with that is, like, we are not going to wait for you. Like, we don't trust anyone. We know that we need to create a context where a Green New Deal is going to pass no matter what. And they, like, in 2018, before there was even a list of co-sponsors, they just barged into politicians' offices and were like, are you going to take fossil fuel money? Yes or no? And they just embarrassed GOP candidates at town halls. And then they're planning a sit-in for after the election. And, like, they're going to do the sit-in no matter what. And then they invite a recently elected progressive, and AOC steps into a moment. But it is a moment that a movement created. And I know that's like I feel like that's like a cliche take. It's like we all tell the story that way. But then we have debates like this where I feel like we forget that insight and we ask the squad directly, like, do it, summon the movement.
Summon the movement, get rid of Pelosi, have power, move the Sunrise Movement and Green New Deal and everything that's gone into that. That is like all movements will find themselves in this next stage where after they get people talking about it, they get the co-sponsors, what is next? And that part is going to be long and windy and doesn't have like A to B direct line, and you're going to have to keep at it. And I feel like if you're like, do this or all else is lost, you're cutting yourself off from the reality that this is going to take several different stages, several different steps, and you're not going to be happy or feel like you're getting anywhere. But that's the battle, is with yourself, to not despair and to actually move forward and like keep trying. And that's the same thing that elected officials have to do, because Congress is a really demoralizing place.
Yeah, doubling, tripling down on a sense of, no, like, this tactic that I came up with based on this idea of leverage, like this specific demand, like, this is it, I've nailed it, and not kind of approaching the debate with humility and saying, could this work, what would happen, and so on. Because I think if it can happen in a good faith way, it's a good thing to happen. Like, what this debate had been going on while the stimulus negotiations had been happening. There was an announcement that there was potentially not going to be any direct payments, any direct stimulus checks in the bipartisan bill. And then we saw progressives announce, including AOC and Pramila Jayapal, as the new chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, announce that they will not vote for a bill without direct stimulus payments.
And so I'm proud of the Progressive Caucus for being so united in fighting for direct relief. And I'm glad to see that there's some movement over the last 24 hours where there was no stimulus checks included. Survival checks is what I call it. Now there is.
Which I think is, again, like, an awareness of how to leverage that power.
Yeah, man, the stimulus stuff, honestly, it's changing by the minute. But it is so powerful to see the Congressional Progressive Caucus step in, for them to actually work the inside and use their leverage. This is what we're talking about. Like, tactically, it's really encouraging to see the Congressional Progressive Caucus actively whipping their members and sending whip notices and are, ready to move as a collective. That is really powerful and exciting, and what we want to keep seeing happen. But, taking all of this and celebrating the fact that there's going to be some relief to people directly, but also knowing that this is not a win, right? Like, this is in the big scheme of things. we're happy that people are going to get something, but this is not a win because people have been suffering for a really, really long time.
It's also, I mean, the thing that is hopeful about this is that when Bernie Sanders and members of the Progressive Caucus organized for this to happen, things started to change in the stimulus negotiations. And there's been a lot of conversations in the past 2 years about how will progressives organize on the inside in these negotiations to make Democratic leadership's legislation policies more progressive. And this is a very clear example of when they do organize, when they do get the votes, when they do even reach beyond the choir and get votes from people who are not necessarily progressives, that they can actually deliver concrete results for working families across this country.
And it's, can we just, for the $1,200 checks and direct relief, like it's a winning message, right? Like, this is what all of Georgia should be about, is this direct relief. Get people money.
More and more people are saying, give us money. And you know, the example of the CPC and withholding the votes to get stimulus checks in, it reminds me again that having the right strategic analysis is not the same as having the resources and the capacity and the power to actually carry out a strategy successfully, right? Because I'm just thinking, I used to work in DC, and there are a lot of progressives in DC hoping, praying, dreaming about the ways that the Congressional Progressive Caucus could do more to leverage its power and do more to leverage its numbers. And this was always a good idea. A lot of people thought of this strategy independently. But it doesn't happen until there's elected officials on the inside who want to invest the time into turning that caucus into a real bloc, throwing its weight around the party. Someone like Pramila Jayapal needs to spend time preparing and building support to become the chair. And so that when she's chair, she has relationships with people that she can call upon to actually move as a united bloc. Am I saying that the CPC has it all figured out now? No. I mean, quite the opposite. Like, I think Amir's right that just getting stimulus checks is not a big victory compared to the immense level of poverty and insecurity that this crisis has brought on millions of Americans. Despite that immense crisis, you know, getting a CPC into place capable of extracting that concession was not easy. It takes time and it takes a lot of work. And I just think being honest about how difficult some fights are going to be makes us better at strategy. You know, for example, we've talked about how much changing the congressional math changes so much about Congress, changes how the speaker is going to relate to your bloc and your ideas. And so it's like, all right, great, easy, done. You know, like, let's do everything we can to just win more primaries, right? Yeah, I don't know. If only it was that easy. Everyone I know who's worked on a primary campaign says some version of, yeah, it's really hard. You need to start building a good campaign extremely early. And then even with that, start to finish, everything is going to be stacked against you, and you got to endure that. I mean, right?
Yes, for example, defeating Eliot Engel and Joe Crowley, two of the most powerful members of the House Democratic Caucus, is extremely, extremely difficult. And winning primaries in 2022 will be even harder. And that's why JD and many people in our movement are planning that right now, is how we can elect even more people like AOC and like Jamal Bowman and like the squad to Congress so that we build a bigger bloc that has more leverage.
Yeah, I mean, people see the end results, they see the candidates, they pay attention to them, you know, towards the end. But there's people like our campaigns team who are working on finding these community leaders and then have to set up an entire campaign apparatus, which I personally know nothing about, but I'm learning bits and pieces, and I'm like, holy crap, it is so much work.
You know, Amira, I know that you have always been a strategic thinker, but Waleed, I knew this guy when he was running a Bernie office in West Philadelphia in 2016.
Did you canvass once with me? I was asking for volunteers every day. Guido, you were doing divestment. Okay.
No, I was demanding that the candidates have stronger climate plans. Anyways, we're not going to relive our fights. But now, look at Waleed planning 2 years in advance to win stuff in 2022. Waleed already knows. He's like, I already know. Everyone already knows. We're obviously not going to win enough in 2021. We're going to have to do this again.
Jamal Bowman defeating Elliot Engel, Joe Crowley losing to AOC, like Bernie, a senator from Vermont, doing pretty well. It doesn't really reflect the strength of the left as much as it reflects how much more we need to do. Like, that this is the floor of what we are able to accomplish, and we just have so much more to go to get to the level of scale that the progressive left has been able to have in this country. We're nowhere near that level of power that the left had in the 1930s or the 1960s. And you can tell by the how much shouting is happening on the YouTube.
Go to the YouTube, on the YouTube.
I was literally born in the 1930s, Amira.
I thought it was 1860 something.
You know, it changes every episode. I'm cosplaying as a different person. I was told to be more animated in this call, and sometimes that has created a schizophrenic thing in my brain where I literally become a different person. It's a healthier way to do this. Guido is like, will you please just move on? Last night, we launched our 2022 candidate recruitment cycle with Representatives-elect Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, hosted by Alexandra Rojas, the executive director of Justice Democrats, and with support from Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Pramila Jayapal to find the next AOC, the next Jamal Bowman, the next Cori Bush, the next set of bold progressive candidates who will fight for Medicare-for-All and a Green New Deal and racial and economic justice.
50% of Congress is made up of millionaires. That's why politicians in both parties are so out of touch with our communities. Justice Democrats are recruiting the next generation of working-class leaders to run for Congress, but we need your help.
If you feel like your member of Congress is not representing you, run to represent your community.
Nominate a leader in your community to run for Congress.
Go to justicedemocrats.com/nominate.
It takes thousands and thousands of nominations of people across the country from all walks of life to find the next AOC, Jamal, and Cori. Jamal was an award-winning middle school principal. He was nominated by a veteran advocate for public schools, and now he's Congressman-elect Jamal Bowman. AOC and Cori Bush were also nominated by people from their community.
And, Jamal says, like, hey, he said this on the call last night. He was like,
yeah, I think in that moment, I believed more in y'all than anything else. But yeah, it was faith. It was faith in you all and faith in the movement, I guess. And it was, it wasn't my wife. She wasn't on board at the time. So it wasn't her. It's funny, in a recent conversation, we were out at dinner. We finally had a date night, which you don't get to have much when you get married and you have kids. So we had a date night, and at the date night, she said she was 90% sure I was crazy and 90% sure, and she used the number 90%, I was going to lose. So I was like, what?
His wife said don't do it, Waleed.
Heavy.
I know, he threw Melissa under the bus like that. Controversial.
Jamal's like, look, on the one hand, I wasn't going to jump into this until I knew that there were people backing me, especially in a situation where my closest people in my life are not supportive of me running for Congress.
He said the vibes were good. We keep telling y'all the vibes are good here.
Yes. But then he was also like, you just got to do it. You just got to fucking do it. I founded that school. I resigned.
Then you got to fucking do it, yo. You got to just do it, man. And I had been in education 20 years and a middle school principal 10 years, a school that I founded, a district school, a public school that I founded. And I resigned that position. And I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it. I left that position and we went for it. And we fucking changed the world, yo.
You just gotta fucking do it. But before Jamal can do it, you need to nominate the Jamal in your community. Amira, what do the people at home need to know?
I'm telling you, this is a lot of chaotic energy on this podcast today, and I'm just like... Okay, submit a nomination at justicedemocrats.com/nominate. Let's go.
All right. The first congressional primaries are happening in March 2022, which means we'll be launching candidates in 2021. tell your friends, nominate a leader. That's the episode. Thank you, Waleed Shaheed.
And stop nominating Bernie Sanders. He's already in the goddamn Senate.
Is that real?
Yes.
Oh my God. Wow. Thank you, Amira.
Thank you, Guido. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
We say Merry Christmas here.
Oh,
okay.
Wow.
Okay, I have a hot take about Christmas. I'm just gonna end it here. I would always get mad when I was a kid when people would like be politically correct and be like, "Happy holidays," and I'm like, I don't have a fucking holiday. I don't know what holiday are you wishing me happy for?
Oh my God, same. That's my whole thing.
I'm
which
like,
is
there's
fine.
Christmas, there's Hanukkah, and there's New Year's. None of those are Muslim holidays. Let's all be real here. Just say the words.
Like sometimes though, as a child, Eid did line up with Christmas and around this time.
Yeah, like twice in our lives.
So I'm just, it could happen. It happens.
Hey, I remember Bill Clinton put a crescent moon in front of the White House, and me and my parents went.
Aww.
Bill Clinton, secret Muslim.
People could also just, say Happy Eid when it's Eid and it doesn't coincide with other holidays, that'd be cool.
Yeah. But don't lie to me. This is when I learned about white liberals.
For any listeners who don't know what Amira and Waleed are talking about, what's Eid, what's the crescent moon, let me just say, Amira and Waleed are not here to educate you.
Please read the Holy Quran and Google it.
And you can Google it. All right. See you next time, folks. Give me a bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Becca Rose is our producer. Leslie Gaston-Bird is our mix engineer. The guy with the aux cord DJing the party is Jeremy Flood. Special thanks, as always, to Amy Westervelt and Michael Catano.